Hey, Grandpa! You lost or just stuck in 1952? The voice cracked across the courtyard like a dropped tray in a chapel. Too loud, too smug, and meant to sting. The words hit the back of the old man's neck as he stood motionless beneath the rising flag, his hand already at his brow in a perfect, silent salute. A second voice chimed in, even louder. Pathetic. Look at him. Like he's still reporting for roll call. Laughter followed. Not wild, just cruel. Calculated. The kind of laughter that dares others to join in. The two young men leaned against a concrete barrier near the visitor center, cell phones out, filming. One had his hoodie up, the other wore mirrored sunglasses despite the dawn gloom. Their smirks were wide, full of teeth, not because they were amused, but because they knew the old man wasn't going to answer. He never did. His silhouette stood out like a relic, shoulders squared, back straight despite the years. His uniform, faded olive and pressed with reverent care, caught the light of the flag's ascent like a memory made visible. His right arm was raised high, palm just touching the rim of his weathered cap. The fingers were steady at first, then, just barely, a tremor. Behind him, a few early arrivals moved across the lot. Junior enlisted support staff, a couple of off-duty officers. Some turned their heads. Most didn't stop. The bugle call rolled through the cool morning air, each note sharp and holy, but the courtyard itself stayed hushed, save for the mockers. "You saluting ghosts or just trying to stay warm, Pops?" one muttered with a scoff. Still, the old man didn't move. A breeze caught the hem of his long coat, tugging it softly like a child reaching for attention. His boots, polished flat black, remained planted, toes aligned. His jaw was tight, eyes forward, not blinking, not reacting. The flag continued its slow, reverent climb. A child nearby, no older than 7, stood holding his mother's hand, sipping from a juice box. He pulled away slightly, watching the man in the old uniform. "Mom," the boy whispered, "why are they laughing at the soldier?" The woman didn't answer. Her hand just squeezed tighter. A base shuttle hummed quietly at the curb, door open, driver watching, frozen halfway through, reaching for his clipboard. The flag reached its peak. The notes held, long and piercing, and then faded, leaving a silence far louder than the laughter had been. But the veteran still did not lower his hand. One of the young men raised his phone again, mumbling something about posting it to a story. His thumb hovered over the screen. Across the courtyard, a uniformed figure had stopped mid-step. His arms were slack at his sides, eyes locked on the man by the flagpole. He didn't move forward. Not yet. But he didn't look away either. The camera kept rolling, but not everyone did. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The flag had finished its rise, and the courtyard was thinning. The young voices that had pierced the morning like barbed wire had moved further off, still laughing, their attention already drifting. But Walter Jennings, known to no one by name on this base, remained exactly where he stood. His hand finally lowered with a slow, exacting motion, not out of fatigue but respect. He didn't sigh. He didn't look around. He simply shifted his cane into his left hand, turned 90 degrees, and began the long walk back toward the shuttle bench without ever looking down. The base was just waking, delivery trucks idling near the supply gate, boots crunching gravel, the rustle of paperwork being handed off from one half-awake corporal to another. But Walter's ritual had started long before the first soldier's alarm went off. Every Friday, just before Reveille, he took the earliest veteran shuttle from town, a courtesy extended to those with proper identification, though few ever used it. He was always the only one to board, and always the first to arrive. He never entered the building, never spoke to staff, and never stayed longer than 10 minutes after the flag was raised. His mission was exact. It was sacred. Walt's movements across the pavement were slow but sharp, measured like drill steps. The cane he used, black walnut with a brass eagle affixed at the handle, clicked once per step, rhythmically, like a metronome for memory. Each Friday, he walked the exact path, from shuttle to flagpole, then back again. He never varied, and though his age showed, in the slope of his shoulders, in the way one of his shoes dragged just slightly, there was a sharpness to him that resisted pity. On his jacket's left breast pocket, faint under the morning haze, was a patch so faded it might have been mistaken for dirt. But under close light, it showed its colors still, the insignia of the United States Marine Corps. Not modern. The stitching was older, almost vintage. Below it, the faint outline of a campaign ribbon bar had once been pinned. But Walt no longer wore medals. He didn't need to. The uniform, pressed by hand, was his memory and his message. No one knew his name. At least, not officially. Inside the visitor center, some of the junior clerks referred to him simply as the Salute. Others, less kindly, called him Old Wake-Up. He'd never introduced himself, never approached anyone. Even the guards at the perimeter gate simply nodded, scanned his card, and waved him through. The name on the plastic badge, Walter Jennings, meant little to the 20-somethings reviewing logs. To them, he was part of the furniture, silent, predictable, forgotten. But Walter remembered everything. He remembered the taste of iron in the air before a mortar hit. He remembered the feel of the field radio headset when they told him Charlie Company was gone. He remembered a Friday, in a jungle that no longer exists on any map, when he buried 4 boys who'd never turned 20. That was why he came. Every Friday since he'd retired, he'd chosen one base, one flag, and one salute. When he'd moved to this town to be closer to a surviving friend who later passed, he'd simply continued. Walt reached the shuttle bench. He did not sit. Instead, he placed both hands on the brass eagle handle of the cane and stood like a monument, immobile, granite-eyed, watching the horizon where the sun was still hesitating. His face, carved with years, held no expression, but the line of his jaw had set firm since the laughter. That part hadn't faded. His silence, even in that moment of humiliation, was not emptiness. It was endurance. It was armor. A young corporal, no older than 22, passed him without so much as a glance. Another carrying coffee looked up briefly, then walked the long way around. No disrespect, but no acknowledgement either. To them, he wasn't in their chain of command. He wasn't in any chain anymore, and in a place where everything is about rank and relevance, he was invisible. But one private, the same who had frozen earlier during the mockery, lingered. He stood now under the visitor center awning, watching Walt from a distance. His name patch read, Hawthorne. He didn't move forward. He didn't raise a hand. But he stared as if trying to understand something deeper than a salute. Walter's breath left him in even measures. He watched the flag. He stood longer than he needed to. Then, precisely when his internal clock told him it was time, always the same minute, he turned again. This time, he walked back toward the shuttle, slowly, with more weight leaning on the cane. The steps took longer, but he never looked back. The laughter still echoed faintly in the corners of his memory. Not the first time, likely not the last. But today, something had shifted. Not in him, in the air. Across the plaza, behind the tinted glass of the visitor center, someone else had not looked away. The metal bench at the shuttle stop was still cool from the night air. Walt stood beside it rather than sitting, as he always did. It wasn't pride. It was discipline. His knees protested, yes, but they did not command him. His gaze stayed down the path, where the shuttle would arrive in exactly 12 minutes. He checked his watch. An old field-issue Bulova, the crystal scratched but reliable. 6:08, right on time. He tightened his grip on the cane and shifted his weight. Behind him, the flagpole fluttered in the soft breeze, its top just catching the early gold of the sun as it crept higher behind the motor pool. Footsteps approached from the rear. The voices came next, louder now, no longer behind cupped hands. The 2 civilians, mid-30s at most, passed behind him again, one of them holding his phone like a trophy. "Guess I got the whole thing," the man muttered, chuckling, thumbs dancing across the screen. "This'll blow up. People love old vets doing cosplay." The other man laughed. "Hope he salutes my coffee next time." They didn't look at Walt this time, but the volume of their sarcasm was meant to be heard. It wasn't mockery behind his back anymore. It was mockery to his side, intentional and designed to echo. Walt did not respond. His head didn't turn, but his breath changed, a quiet tightening of the ribs, a long exhale through the nose. Not weakness, not pain, containment, the kind of self-control only decades of silence could form. He adjusted his jacket collar again with slow, precise fingers and pulled the brim of his cap forward a fraction of an inch, shielding his eyes. The sun was brighter now. Near the administrative doors, 2 enlisted men stood beneath the shade of a low overhang. One of them, tall, thin, uniformed with a loosened belt, pointed toward Walt. "There he is again, saluting like he's still getting inspected." The other smirked. "Maybe he's hoping someone will call him Sergeant again." They chuckled, not cruelly, but without understanding, without effort. It was the sound of comfortable dismissal. Behind them, the building's automatic doors slid open and shut in slow rhythm as others came and went, heads turned downward, eyes lost in schedules and routine. Walt shifted his stance but remained standing. The cane tapped once, a grounding gesture. Not impatience, just rhythm. He glanced to the far side of the plaza, where a row of vehicles idled, exhaust rising in translucent ribbons. A bus door opened with a hiss. No one got out. His watch now read 6:11. From across the lot, a woman in civilian base attire exited the commissary office holding a to-go coffee. She paused, looked toward Walt, eyes narrowing for a second as if trying to place him. Then, just as quickly, she looked down at her phone and changed direction, walking a wide arc to avoid him. Not in fear, in awkwardness, like passing someone reciting a private prayer and not knowing whether to stop or ignore. One of the mocking men had wandered further off, but now returned, walking toward the shuttle bench casually, scrolling his phone. As he neared, he glanced at Walt and offered a grin so thin it couldn't have held air. "Still standing? Thought maybe you'd freeze in place like a statue." Walt's eyes flicked toward him, briefly. A second only, then turned away. The man chuckled. "Respect, though. Takes guts to cosplay at your age." He walked on. There was silence again, but not peace, just stillness, stretched thin. A young corporal exited the main building mid-stride with his backpack slung over one shoulder. He glanced toward Walt, slowed a moment, then kept moving. Something in his eyes lingered, like recognition, but no words passed. No salute, no nod. Then came the worst moment. From a few yards behind, the second mocking civilian raised his phone again, pressing record. "Come on," he whispered toward his friend. "Just do it." The first man hesitated. Then, with a boyish grin, he mimicked a stiff salute, cartoonishly exaggerated, elbow flared out, palm to forehead, before dropping into a dramatic bow. "For your service, sire," he yelled in a theatrical voice, loud enough for all to hear. A couple of young recruits nearby turned. One snorted. Another looked away quickly. The rest ignored it. Walt's eyes did not close, but his hand, resting on the cane, tightened, knuckles whitening, then releasing. Slowly, he turned his shoulders, just enough to face forward again. The brim of his cap shadowed most of his expression, but something had stiffened in his spine. Only one person stepped forward. A young base medic, no more than 24, with a patch freshly sewn on his uniform, raised a hand partway and said, "Hey, that's enough." The civilian mocker raised an eyebrow. "It's just a joke. Chill out." His voice had an edge now, thin-skinned defensiveness. The medic hesitated. He looked toward Walt, then toward the uniformed personnel still standing by. No one joined him. The moment passed. He lowered his hand and stepped back. Walt did not move. He stood beside the bench, still upright, still silent. And above them, unnoticed by all, a shadow moved behind the visitor center glass. Someone was standing, watching, reaching for a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. The shuttle had not arrived yet. Walt remained standing beside the bench, his left hand resting on the eagle-headed cane, the other hanging quietly at his side. The plaza was emptier now. Most of the base personnel had gone inside for morning muster or breakfast detail. The two civilians had wandered off toward the visitor center, their laughter reduced to muffled noise behind the glass. But the tension they left behind still clung to the air, invisible, like the lingering scent of oil on a rifle long since cleaned. The breeze shifted slightly, catching the corner of Walt's jacket. He pressed it down with a deliberate hand, smoothing the fabric with a gesture that was far more than habit. It was muscle memory, the same careful precision drilled into him during basic training in the early spring of 1955. His body may have bent with time, but the rituals had never faded. His movements were still framed by decades of service, of watchfulness, of loss. He glanced down at his boots. Well-maintained, black leather, the stitching slightly worn but always polished. He reached with care and wiped a smudge from the toe with the edge of his handkerchief, folding it back into his pocket with crisp corners. There was no vanity in it. It wasn't for show. This was about honor, and honoring meant being prepared, clean, precise, presentable. Even now. Especially now. Walt's eyes lifted toward the flag, now fully unfurled and catching the morning sun in rippling bursts. He didn't just look at it. He read it. Every color, every seam. His mind drifted for a moment, not away but back, to another flag, another morning, another Friday, decades ago, when the jungle heat clung to his skin and the sky above Khe-Sanh was anything but peaceful. He remembered standing in formation, saluting the stars and stripes raised on a half-destroyed bamboo pole. The heat, the silence, the men who didn't return, but his body remained still, grounded in the present. Inside the visitor center, the tint of the window kept his watcher obscured, but not inactive. Sergeant Major Daniel Brody had not moved for several minutes. He'd watched every frame of the scene unfold, standing just far enough from the glass to remain unseen. His arms were crossed, his jaw clenched. When the mockery reached its peak, when the young medic had stepped forward and been dismissed, Brody had closed his eyes. Not in shame, in restraint. Brody was not a man prone to public outbursts. After 34 years in the United States Marine Corps, and the last 4 as a base liaison officer, he had learned to measure silence. But what he witnessed this morning had unsettled him in a way few things still could. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the familiarity of the man outside. Not his face, but the posture, the discipline, the way he had folded his collar, how he had stood in front of that flag like it was his post. Brody moved to his desk, opened the top drawer with care, and removed a folded cloth bundle, khaki canvas, stiff from disuse. He undid the knot. Inside were 2 items, an old insignia bar from a fallen comrade and a silver wristwatch that no longer ticked. He didn't put either on. He just held them in his hand. His fingers tightened. Outside, Walt took a few slow steps toward the shuttle sign. His back was straight, not by defiance, but by training. His spine bore the weight of a name that was no longer spoken by anyone on this base. Not because they'd forgotten it, but because they never knew it. But Walt knew all their names. The ones who never came home. The ones whose dog tags he had carried in his pocket until the war ended. He had written to their mothers. He had saluted at their empty caskets. He had kept watch every Friday since. He checked his watch again. 6:14. The shuttle should have arrived by now. Still, he did not sit. Just beyond the corner of the building, the young medic lingered. Not by assignment, just by guilt. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair slightly out of regulation. A soldier still early in his journey. He looked toward Walt, then toward the entrance of the visitor center. Conflict hung in his eyes, but his feet didn't move. Walt adjusted the brim of his cap again. The fabric was worn from years of touch. The stitching near the bill was starting to fray, but it was still his. He'd kept it through 4 moves, 2 surgeries, and the death of his wife. It had survived more than most things in his life. Then, the door opened. Sergeant Major Brodie stepped out, not hurried, not hesitant. His boots struck the stone path with the confidence of a man used to attention. But his gaze wasn't seeking eyes. It was focused forward, toward the veteran who still stood, waiting for a ride that had yet to come. The courtyard was nearly empty now, just a few administrative staff inside, and a couple of enlisted finishing their rounds. But the silence had changed. It was no longer neglect. It was anticipation. Walt turned slightly at the sound of the footsteps. He didn't react with surprise. He simply acknowledged the presence by adjusting his posture, not as a greeting, but as a return to readiness, the way a soldier tightens up when a superior enters the room, even if they're no longer under orders. Brodie approached until there was just a single stride between them. He stopped. The silence held. And then, without command, without speech, Sergeant Major Brodie lifted his hand in a clean, practiced salute, one of reverence, one of brotherhood. Walt looked at him for the first time. His eyes blinked once, then slowly, his right arm came up, and he returned the salute. No words, no medals, just presence. From the edge of the courtyard, the young medic stood straighter. The salute lingered in the open air, invisible yet immovable. 2 arms raised in reverent symmetry, 2 generations bound not by conversation, but by the shared weight of memory. Walt's hand trembled slightly as it held the line, but his form remained resolute. Sergeant Major Brodie's arm stayed locked, his fingers flat, his shoulders square. The world around them seemed to fade for a moment. No footfalls, no morning chatter, not even the distant hum of the motor pool. Just silence. Earned, not given. Then, just as slowly as it had risen, Walt's hand lowered, steady despite the tremor that traveled down to his elbow. Brodie's followed. They did not speak. They didn't need to. The sun had cleared the barracks now, casting long golden rays across the concrete, illuminating the thin folds in Walt's jacket, like creases in old parchment. The salute wasn't acknowledgement of present rank or regulation. It was memory, of foxholes and final orders, of boots in mud and letters left unsent. From the shadows at the side of the administration building, the young medic still stood frozen. His eyes had not left them since Brodie emerged. The tension in his jaw had softened now, the indecision replaced by quiet awe. He had seen the mockery, yes, and done nothing. But this was reverence made real, and it disarmed his shame more effectively than any scolding could. A low wind passed through the courtyard, kicking up dust in a soft spiral near the base of the flagpole. Walt turned his gaze toward it again, instinctively checking the flag's positioning as if inspecting a post. His lips didn't move, but the way he looked at the stars and stripes made it clear he was counting. Not stitches, but names, lives, Fridays. Brodie reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded cloth he had taken from his desk. With both hands, he unwrapped it with care, revealing a pair of insignia pins and a single faded ribbon, silver gray, with a thin line of crimson at its center. A memory, not an award. He extended it toward Walt, open-palmed. Walt didn't reach for it. Instead, he let his eyes fall upon the ribbon and held them there for a long breath. Then, he looked up, not at Brodie, but into his eyes. The expression wasn't one of surprise. It was recognition, not of the man, but of the moment, of what was being offered, of why it mattered. Brodie spoke only once. It was my CO's. He never came home, but he said to pass it forward when it mattered. I think he meant today. Walt nodded once. He lifted his hand and accepted the ribbon gently, as if it were glass. He didn't pocket it. He held it in his open palm, turned toward the sun, letting the light hit the faded colors. Behind them, the courtyard began to change. One of the base clerks, an older woman in glasses, who had seen Walt week after week but never truly seen him, stepped out of the doorway and paused. She wasn't carrying anything. She wasn't rushing. She simply stood, watching. The young medic finally moved, walking with deliberate steps until he stood behind Brody. He didn't speak, didn't salute, but he stood still, spine straight, arms at his side, the way soldiers stand when words are not enough. Moments later, 2 junior enlisted men emerged from the mess building and saw the gathering. One gestured slightly, confused, then caught the posture of Brody, of Walt, of the medic behind them. They exchanged a glance. Then both stopped where they stood, adjusted their uniforms, and faced the flag. No one told them to. Another man came, then a woman. A small group formed behind them, a widening arc of stillness. Walt hadn't moved. The ribbon remained in his palm. His eyes stayed fixed forward, not on the growing crowd, but on the space above the flag, a space only he could truly see. A Friday in another country, another war, another sound of colors rising through gun smoke. Brody's voice came again, not loud, but steady. "I never knew why you came, but I knew there was a reason," Walt replied, finally, his voice gravel and air but steady. "I promised them. One Friday for every friend who didn't get one." Brody swallowed. He didn't nod. He didn't look away. "Then we'll stand with you for everyone left." The wind shifted again, bringing the scent of diesel and morning bread from the mess line. But even that felt quiet now, like the base itself had stilled, sensing a ritual was underway. From the far end of the parking area, a senior non-commissioned officer emerged, recognized the gathering, and froze. He adjusted his belt, then crossed the courtyard and took position at the edge of the group. Another followed. Uniforms varied, some pressed, some wrinkled, some half-ready. It didn't matter. They weren't saluting yet, but they were standing. The weight of a single man's devotion was now being shared. Walt remained motionless, not from frailty, but from fidelity. His shoulders square, his spine resisting the age tugging at it, he stood in front of the growing line with the same calm he had held through artillery blasts and burial ceremonies. His fingers curled slightly over the cane's eagle head, but his knuckles never whitened. Even the tremor in his right hand seemed to lessen, as if steadied by the presence assembling behind him. Sergeant Major Brody had taken one step back, not to retreat, but to make room. His boots were planted, heels locked, and his chin lifted, not in defiance, but in shared purpose. He had not spoken again. There was no need. His salute earlier had said more than any speech. Now his silence said even more. A private first class who had barely passed his last drill stood in the line, helmet tucked under his arm. He did not understand the full story, but he understood enough. He had seen Walt before, once, in passing, when he was leaving the mess hall and caught sight of the old man standing still in the fog. He had thought nothing of it then. Today, it felt like a mistake. A woman from base supply approached with hesitation, holding a folding chair. She didn't want to interrupt the silence. She simply nodded toward Brody, who gave her the smallest motion of his hand. She set it quietly beside Walt. Walt glanced at it, then slowly, very slowly, lowered himself into it with the same care a soldier lowers a flag at dusk. His knees bent, his back remained straight. Even seated, his posture spoke. He was still on watch. From the edge of the line, the young medic took a few steps forward, hesitated, and then finally stood beside Walt. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Sir, I'm sorry I didn't do more earlier." Walt turned his head just enough to meet the young man's eyes. He didn't speak. He just nodded, the kind of nod that lifts guilt, the kind that says, "It's not too late to stand right." A corporal joined the line, followed by an airman. A mechanic still in grease-streaked coveralls paused by the corner, looked over, and walked quietly into place. None of them asked what was happening. None of them had been told, but they came. Then, Brody turned toward the growing formation. His voice, low but commanding, carried without needing force. "Attention!" The line snapped upright. Walt, still seated, lifted his chin slightly. The expression on his face did not change, but something beneath the skin, something in the depth of his weathered eyes, softened. It was not surprise. It was recognition, as if he had always known this moment would come. He just didn't know when, or who would be brave enough to begin it. The flag above fluttered slightly in the higher breeze, casting shifting shadows across the plaza. The line of men and women now extended beyond the curb, some in full regulation, others half-dressed for duty, others still just in civilian clothing with base passes hanging from their necks. Rank didn't matter. Shoes didn't matter. What mattered was that they stood. Walt's hand shifted slightly on the ribbon he still held. The fabric was curled now, the sun warming its threads. His fingers closed around it, not to hide it, but to feel it, to remind himself that memory lives in objects and meaning lives in moments. A lieutenant colonel arrived from the administration building. He slowed his pace as he crossed the pavement, then stopped mid-step as he saw the line. His face tensed, then softened. He did not interrupt. He stood still, and then, without prompt, stepped into the far end of the line. The two civilians who had laughed earlier now hovered awkwardly near the sidewalk, their phones lowered, their smirks gone. One of them shifted his weight nervously, glancing at Walt, then at Brody. The younger one leaned toward his friend and muttered, "We should go." But Brody heard them. He turned, not with fury, but with absolute stillness, and looked directly at them. There was no anger in his face, but there was something heavier, disappointment shaped like stone. The older of the two cleared his throat. We didn't think." Brody cut him off, not with words, but by raising one hand and pointing, calmly, toward the line. The two men didn't speak again. They did not leave. They crossed the space slowly, uncomfortably, but they came. And at the very edge, they stood, not fully at attention, but not apart, not anymore. Walt's eyes closed for a brief moment, not sleep, not weariness, but a quiet prayer, unspoken and unfinished. Then he opened them and looked to Brody. Brody stepped forward again, took a single knee beside the seated veteran, and asked quietly, "Sir, who do you salute for?" The pause that followed did not need to be filled, but Walt answered, "Every friend who never made it back. Every Friday. Same time, same promise." Brody nodded. "Then we'll hold the line with you." And just like that, the base had changed. The courtyard, once a corridor of routine footfalls and idle chatter, now held stillness like a breath drawn and not yet released. The line had grown without command, shaped not by duty but by something deeper, respect born from witnessing. From behind the glass of the administration windows, faces had begun to appear, pressed just enough to catch the rising silence. None of them spoke. They simply watched. Walt sat at the edge of the folding chair, his back straight, as if he feared sagging would betray the ritual. His cane rested across his lap, parallel to the seam of his trousers. He was still holding the folded ribbon Brody had given him. His thumb traced the edge slowly, rhythmically, as though counting off names no one else could hear. Brody stood just behind him, not guarding him, not honoring him, but joining him. No ceremony had been announced. No authority had granted this moment. And that, perhaps, was what made it sacred. It was happening not because someone told them to stand, but because they could no longer bear to sit. The young medic had moved closer again. He now stood just to Walt's left, eyes forward, hands behind his back in a quiet parade rest. He did not speak. He did not fidget. But his presence was heavy with reverence. His gaze remained fixed on the flag, though every so often his eyes flicked toward Walt's posture as if learning through imitation. A soft scrape echoed behind them. One of the clerks from Human Resources, normally buried behind spreadsheets and policies, was rolling out another folding chair. She paused as she reached the courtyard's center, unsure where to place it. Walt turned his head slightly and gestured gently to a spot 2 feet to his left. She nodded, set it down. He did not use it, but someone else would. A corporal stepped forward and asked no permission. He sat beside Walt, then stood again, slowly, and offered his own folded service cap into the old veteran's lap. Walt accepted it without question. His hand didn't tremble now. It rested over the offering with silent gratitude. In that moment, something invisible passed between them, like the quiet handoff of a torch. No music played, no speech rose, but everyone present understood what had begun. Walt's eyes scanned the growing crowd, not in judgment, not in expectation, but in quiet affirmation. He was not cataloging names, he was counting hearts. And hearts, once awakened, do not return to sleep. Brody finally stepped forward again. He didn't face the crowd. He faced Walt. His words were few and quiet, barely more than breath. Every salute means something. You don't need to know what. You just stand for it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for compliance. And because he didn't demand it, the weight of the words sank deeper. The lieutenant colonel who had quietly joined the line earlier now adjusted his position. He stepped forward, saluted once toward the flag, then turned and saluted Walt directly. The gesture was not rigid, but it was full. He held it, then dropped it, nodded once, and returned to position. No title needed, no declaration made. Behind him more followed, a motor pool technician in oil-stained fatigues, a chaplain still carrying his morning notes, a recruit with freshly buzzed hair and eyes wide with something he hadn't yet named. They all stepped forward, paused, saluted, then took a place in the growing semicircle that had become something beyond formation. The air was changing, charged with a reverence too old to be taught, yet too present to ignore. It was a transfer of weight, from one man's shoulders to many. Then came the ripple, the first moment of release. A woman from legal services stepped beside the flagpole, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled something from her pocket. It was a simple slip of paper. On it, a name. She bent down, placed it at the base of the flag, and stood again. A pause. Then a maintenance worker followed. Another name. Another scrap of paper. It wasn't planned. It wasn't coordinated. But one by one, people began to contribute. Not documents or flowers, but names. Handwritten, folded. Left in silence at the flag's base like sacred offerings to memory. Walt looked at them, but did not speak. His fingers tightened around the ribbon. His eyes moistened, not from sadness, but from the unbearable relief of not being forgotten. Brody stepped beside him once more, bent slightly at the waist, and asked the question only another soldier would ask. Vietnam? Walt nodded, just once. His voice, when it came, was rough but whole. K-San. Lost 4 on a Friday. Promised I'd never miss another. Brody lowered his eyes for a second, absorbing that weight, then looked back up. And you haven't. Walt's reply came with a breath so long it seemed to hold decades. Every week. Rain. Snow. Even when I couldn't feel my right leg. I came. The young medic heard that. His eyes widened and he stepped forward again. You were there? You really kept it? Every week? Walt didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was not empty. It was full. The kind of silence you earn. The kind that speaks for others who cannot. The courtyard held that silence like a chapel holds its breath. By then there was no need for a schedule. No orders were given. But everyone present knew. They would stand every Friday now. Whether Walt came or not, they would stand. The folding chair creaked just slightly as Walt shifted, adjusting the pressure on his hip. His right hand, still draped lightly over the cane, tapped once against the metal tip, a sound almost lost beneath the rising wind. He didn't look at anyone now. His gaze had returned to the flag, to that stretch of fabric pulled tight against the dawn, rustling like a whisper only he could hear. Behind his glasses, his eyes held a distant gleam, not of tears, but of light reflected from memory. Memory so potent, it had form and heat. Sergeant Major Brody stepped forward again, but this time he lowered himself to one knee beside the old man. He didn't crowd him. He simply bent low enough that his voice would not carry past Walt's ear. Vietnam? He asked again, this time with softness, not curiosity. Walt's reply came after a long pause. His jaw moved. not to speak first, but to work through something caught behind it, a truth that had long stayed behind his teeth. Then he said it, just 2 words. Kei-san. Brody closed his eyes, not out of surprise, out of respect. That name, Kei-san, was not a place. It was a wound in the soil of memory, a wound soaked in sweat and gunpowder and the cries of boys trying to hold a hill they had no name for. You were there, Brody whispered. Walt nodded slowly, his gaze unmoving. March of '68, the Friday before Easter. His voice cracked, not from emotion, but from the dust of time caught in the back of his throat. We held a trench that week. Mud over our boots, blood in the sandbags. Lost 4 that morning. He paused. They were 19, all of them. The young medic, still standing just behind them, lowered his head. His mouth parted slightly. He was doing the math. His own age mirrored those boys. The sound of traffic outside the base seemed far away now, muffled like background noise to a memory unfolding in real time. I told them I'd remember, Walt continued. Said it while we waited for choppers that never came. I said, if I'm the only one left, I'll stand for you. Every week. For as long as I've got breath in me. Brody swallowed hard. That's what this is, he murmured. Every Friday. Walt finally looked away from the flag, turning toward him. Same time, same place. 5 minutes before colors. I don't say a word. I don't bring attention. I just stand. I promised them I'd stand. Brody reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a cloth square, dark blue, almost black, and unfolded it. Inside lay a faded patch, crossed rifles over a silver arc, 3rd Battalion. He held it in his hand and placed it gently on Walt's knee. I lost a friend there too. Forward observer. Never found him. Walt looked down at the patch, then back up. His face didn't show shock. It showed something deeper. Recognition, not of the man, but of the weight, of carrying the uncarried. What was his name? He asked. Elliot Barnes, Brody replied. He always wore a photo in his helmet. His mom. Smiled through the whole firefight. Walt nodded slowly. I remember him. Always volunteered for the hot zones. Brody's lips pressed tight, and he nodded in return. No more words, no more names. Just a bond forged in the ash of memory. The young medic stepped closer now, his voice barely audible. Sir, who are you, really? Walt didn't respond immediately. Then, slowly, with the reverence of someone stating not a title but a legacy, Brody answered for him. Walter Jennings, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Vietnam veteran, fire team leader, Silver Star recipient, and the last man standing from his trench. Walt didn't flinch at the words. He didn't puff with pride. He simply closed his eyes once and whispered, "They were the heroes. I just kept standing." One of the men in line, a base mechanic who had served 2 tours in Iraq, wiped at his cheek. He didn't try to hide it. His voice broke as he said aloud, to no one in particular, "We didn't know." A corporal nearby took 1 step forward, then 2, and saluted again, this time not to the flag, but to the man beside the chair. One by one, others followed. No command was given, no order required, but every hand raised now felt like it was lifting more than a gesture. It was lifting a promise. The 2 young civilians who had mocked him stood off to the side still, their heads bowed, hands tucked in their pockets. The older one, the one who had laughed the loudest, took a shaky step forward. "Sir," he said, voice thin, "I didn't know who you were." Walt didn't look up. He didn't nod. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply answered, flat and measured, "You don't need to know who I am. Just know why I salute." The man lowered his head. He didn't try again. The wind picked up then, lifting the ribbon in Walt's hand just slightly, a twist of red and gold fluttering like a heartbeat on fabric. For the first time since the beginning of the ceremony, the crowd saw his hand tremble again, not from weakness, but from the gravity of having finally been seen. And at the base of the flagpole, among the scraps of folded paper, a new slip of cardstock had been placed. It read only one line, Friday 5 a.m., we stand with him. The crowd had swelled, not in noise, but in presence. From the edges of the courtyard to the outer paths between buildings, they had come. Uniforms of all colors, ranks, and eras stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians, janitors, clerks, medics, and cooks. It was no longer about who Walt was, but what he represented. No one had been summoned. No memo had gone out. Yet they had come, drawn by something unspoken but unmistakable. The call of dignity, long neglected. The flag above them now hung still, its rise complete, its position unquestioned. But beneath it, the real ceremony was taking shape. Not one of folding chairs or speeches, but of actions small enough to be missed unless one watched closely. Shoes were being polished in the gravel, postures corrected without instruction, hats removed with slow, deliberate hands, and then the unmistakable presence of command. A black SUV eased into the drive behind the administration building, stopping without sound or ceremony. No sirens, no staff, just a single man stepping out. Colonel David McLaren, commanding officer of the base. He did not wear a formal dress uniform, only standard duty fatigues, creased, neat, but without fanfare. He walked toward the flagpole, eyes scanning the crowd, not for order but for understanding. He didn't call for attention. He didn't demand a platform. He simply walked straight to Walt, whose hand had just begun to relax around the cane again. "Sergeant Jennings," the colonel said. His voice was even, but not cold. It carried the tone of a man speaking with another soldier, not a subordinate. "Thank you for your post. You've kept it longer than most of us have worn the uniform." Walt nodded. "Sir," the colonel gestured to the paper scraps at the base of the pole. "Those names, are they yours?" Walt looked down for the first time since the flag had risen. "They're not mine, Colonel. They're everyone's. We just forget sometimes." The colonel crouched, picked one up, read it quietly, then placed it back with both hands. He stood again and took a small laminated card from his breast pocket, handing it to Walt. "From this day forward, we'll raise the flag 5 minutes early on Fridays. It's been approved, and it's permanent." Walt took the card. His hand didn't shake this time. The ink was simple. Base Policy Addendum. WJ5 Legacy Salute. Fridays, 4:55 a.m. When legacy personnel are present, all standing is voluntary, but expected. He looked back up, and for the first time since arriving that morning, a trace of something touched the edge of his expression. Not a smile, not pride, but a quiet release. Like a long-held note had finally been allowed to fade. Brody stepped beside the colonel and added, "And Sergeant Jennings has agreed to consult with our Veteran Affairs liaisons. He'll be advising us on ceremonial protocol moving forward." Walt blinked. "I have?" Brody smiled gently. "You have now." The colonel chuckled once, then extended his hand. "We'll be honored to have your insight. And every Friday, your presence." Walt took the handshake with both hands, his cane resting now against the chair, unneeded for this brief exchange. Around them, the courtyard held still, but the stillness had changed. No longer hesitant, now reverent. From the edge of the crowd, the young man who had mocked Walt earlier stepped forward again. This time his phone was nowhere in sight. In its place, he carried a folded lawn chair. He didn't speak. He just walked to the side of the courtyard, opened it, and sat, facing the flag, alone. Minutes passed, then a second chair unfolded, then a third. Within 15 minutes, a semicircle of seated witnesses had formed. Not a crowd waiting for a show, but a formation honoring something sacred, something that had always been there, something they had simply never seen. And standing now at the entrance of the courtyard was a young mother with a child on her hip. The child pointed to Walt and asked in a clear, innocent voice, "Is he a soldier?" The mother knelt down and whispered, "He still is." That truth, once whispered, passed through the space like a slow wind. The next week, laminated sheets appeared in the base cafeteria. No bold headlines, just a simple message printed at the top. Friday, 4:55 a.m. Flag rising. All who can stand, stand. No one signed it, but everyone understood it. The following Friday came with no headlines, no announcements, and no banners. The sky was the same muted blue-gray it had always been at that hour, cool with the promise of morning, yet heavy with the weight of memory. But something had shifted, not in the weather, but in the people. At exactly 4:45 a.m., the base gates opened early. A few guards nodded without a word as Walter Jennings stepped off the base shuttle, his cane tapping softly against the concrete with each step. He wore the same olive uniform, brushed and pressed, the same cap, the same boots polished by hand the night before. But this time, he was not alone. Walking beside him was a young administrative clerk, barely 23, uniform sharp, but expression unsure. His name was Jacob, and though he didn't speak during the walk, his presence told its own story. He had volunteered, not because someone told him to, but because something inside had shifted since the week prior. A need to understand, perhaps, or maybe simply a need to walk beside something greater than himself. Walt did not explain. He never had. But when they reached the base of the flagpole, he looked at the young man, gestured to the folding chair nearby, and said, "Stand until it's raised. Sit after. Then we leave, that's all." Jacob nodded once. No salute yet, just listening. Across the courtyard, more figures began arriving. Quiet, steady, no formation. Some in duty gear, others in civilian clothes. They came alone, in pairs, in small clusters. They didn't speak as they arrived. They just stood. At 4:55 a.m. sharp, a low hum buzzed through the base's PA system. Not a call to action, but a signal that something had begun. No commands, just a sound. And then, the bugle. Walt rose slowly, his cane left leaning on the chair. His right hand rose, not with stiffness, but with the exactness of a man who had never forgotten how, not even for a day. His arm leveled, his fingers locked. The salute was perfect. The flag began to rise. No music played beyond the clear tone of revel echoing from the speakers. But in the stillness, in the quiet breath of gathered silence, the meaning grew heavy, like fog settling over water. Each person, regardless of age or rank, stood as if time had paused, as if memory itself were being raised with the flag. Jacob raised his hand to match Walt's, not with the practiced discipline of training, but with the trembling reverence of understanding. His posture wasn't perfect. His fingers weren't textbook, but his intention was. By the time the flag reached the top, over 80 people stood in the courtyard. Some had come from night shifts, some from bunks, barely awake. One woman still wore running gear, breath misting in the morning chill. At precisely 5 a.m., the flag stopped. Walt held the salute for one breath more, two, then lowered it. He turned, took his cane, and walked back toward the shuttle. Jacob followed. No words exchanged, no applause. Behind them, the crowd remained, many still standing. And beside the flagpole, embedded in stone just beneath the pole's base, was a new plaque installed earlier that week. It bore no name, no rank, no date, just this. This flag is raised not for show, but for memory, for the ones who stood before us, for those still standing. Every Friday thereafter, the base continued to gather. No one was ever ordered, no roster ever made. But each week, someone new walked beside Walt. Some asked questions. Some just walked in silence. Some came just once. Others never missed again. Months later, the two men who had mocked Walt the morning of the insult were seen at the edge of the crowd. Not front and center. Not pretending to lead. Just there. One of them knelt once to pick up Walt's cane when it dropped. He didn't say anything, just handed it back with both hands. And as the seasons changed, and the air grew colder again, a local news outlet caught wind of the gatherings. They asked for interviews, for permission to film, to tell the story of the veteran and the salute. The base declined. No story, they said, just memory. And at 4:55 a.m., each Friday, under the same stretch of sky, The same silent ritual unfolds. The cane rests against the chair. The old soldier lifts his arm. The flag rises, and the base stands. Not for him, for what he never stopped standing for. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.